takes pleasure in attracting a stellar list of speakers that address today's most relevant issues. The club's place as a refuge for rich discussion and networking has never wavered after 123 seasons.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is David Simmons, and I'm president-elect of the Canadian Club of Toronto. I couldn't be more excited to welcome you to a discussion that is top of mind for everyone. We are officially in election season. It's sort of an election fever sweeping the nation south of the border in the United States, and certainly it's top of mind to many, many Canadians. So as we join the world and watch and wonder in what is a decidedly unprecedented year, I'm very, very pleased to welcome journalists and policy experts to our podium from Washington, D.C. They are all in Washington, but they are in separate rooms, respecting how we manage our way through an unprecedented pandemic in the world. The discussion today is going to unpack some of the trends, some of the themes, some of the behind-the-scenes stories that go into the stories that we see on our news networks every evening, and give us insights into what the election might hold for one of the most important relationships in the world, the relationship between Canada and the United States. Before we dive into the topic, I want to give you a couple of housekeeping instructions. You can click a button on your screen that says click here to switch to stream. That might help the feed if you find that it's choppy throughout the presentation. And if you want to ask questions, I'd encourage you to do that. There's time allotted today to ask questions. You can use the questions tab and we will help get those questions to our moderator. There's also a request help button on the screen if you need it. I want to thank today's sponsor. Their generous contribution has made it possible for us to offer this important discussion free to our attendees. Today's sponsor is Crestview Strategy, so I want to thank them for their support and their investment into today. The Canadian Club is a nonprofit organization. We've been getting people together for over 100 years, and it's because of our sponsors that we're able to do that. So thank you to Crestview for your support. Let me throw to our panelists now. I'm going to introduce them. It's rare. It's actually not rare because Canada is such a wonderful place and we have such great people. But it's special to introduce three panelists who I can call friends. Jackson Proskow is the Washington Bureau Chief for Global News. Some of you will remember Jackson from TV, like yesterday or tomorrow or today. You'll also remember his coverage of City Hall when he was called, I will say, one of the most talented journalists in Canada. Katie Simpson is the foreign correspondent for Washington, in Washington for CBC News. Katie is also a social media phenom, so I'd encourage you to follow her on social media to get inside tips and tricks of what's happening in Washington. And Scotty Greenwood is the CEO of the Canada-US Business Council. She's also a managing partner for the Washington Bureau of Crestview Strategy. She's a policy expert who you would have seen offering insights during the renegotiation of NAFTA. She's also the former chief of staff to the U.S. ambassador to Canada. One of the club's traditions that has not changed, despite that we're not able to be together in person, is that we toast our wonderful country and all that it does for us. So I'd ask you to join me if you can, if you have a glass, and toast to Canada.
To Canada.
Scotty.
Cheers.
Oh, cheers.
Cheers.
Scotty, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you, David. And it's so great to be back at the Canadian Club. I wish we were together in person, but your country won't let me in. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. Really delighted to have an opportunity actually to interview journalists for a change. I'm used to getting interviewed and beaten up. Maybe not totally beaten up by our friends here, but it's great to have two people that are in the arena, two people that are bringing you in Canada vital news. So I'm excited for this conversation. We're going to get right into it. And I think I'm going to start with a couple of softballs here because, just ease right into it. So Katie and Jackson, first and foremost, please tell us all who is going to win the presidential election and when will we know the outcome? Katie?
Oh, those are such easy questions. Answer is no journalist ever wins when they make predictions. And number two, I have no idea. Jackson?
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Katie. I don't think anybody's going to get ahead by making predictions this year. But I will say there's either two scenarios. One, we're either going to know really quickly on election night if a state like Florida or Ohio goes in, especially for Joe Biden. Scenario two, it's going to be a squeaker, and we might not know until Friday when states like Pennsylvania, which is super key, says that they will finish tabulating all of their mail-in ballots. So who knows?
Well, you guys are both pretty optimistic. I think it could even take longer than that. But we already have a question from our esteemed guest here, which is outline for us, if you would, the worst case scenario. And by worst, I guess that's a subjective measurement, but I would say worse in terms of not knowing. Or what do you think the worst case is? And what do you think is realistic? There's a lot of paranoia, there's a lot of rhetoric, but Jackson, how badly could it go in your judgment?
Yeah, so I think the worst case scenario from an undecided perspective would be if there was a tie in the electoral college. So 270, and that it ends up being decided by the state level delegations in Congress. And talk about a mess that would be. And the way that it could end up in a tie, there's all sorts of permutations of that. What happens if one state's results are disputed, and that's how we get there? What happens if this ends up in the courts? There's the risk of sort of a 2000 Bush versus Gore scenario. And then the other side of this is either, real concerns about violence at the state level, especially. You have a lot of these state level militia groups in states like Oregon, Michigan, that, Department of Homeland Security has warned are sort of the most grave security threat that people in this country face. And will there be violence either at the polls on election day or in the days after? And does that spin out of perhaps President Trump sort of either refusing to accept the results if they don't go his way or casting doubt about the results if we're in sort of a disputed period of time here?
Katie, what did you think when Trump said in the recent debate he didn't condemn white supremacy, and he said to the Proud Boys, which is an extremist militia group, stand back and stand by? Does that worry you?
Well, that is certainly something that seems to have energized this group in the hours after President Donald Trump made those comments during that debate. We saw the Proud Boys take that slogan and actually put it into their logo and share it out on social media. So that is something that is a concern, whether Donald Trump has actually energized some of those groups that have been flagged as a concern and that people are very genuinely concerned about. The night that happened, I was in actually Ohio, and we were covering a Republican watch party. It was inside a bar, and it had 900 people, and very few people were actually wearing masks. It was a very strange sort of situation. And anytime any sort of issue came up around the issue of race, and that moment where that Proud Boy issue comment came up, the Republican crowd in this particular establishment in suburban Ohio, there were huge, huge cheers. So it's certainly something that Donald Trump's base has been listening for, not necessarily the Proud Boy comments, but Donald Trump certainly has a lot of support on his handling of race relation issues based on within his own party. So
that leads me, you talk about being there in Ohio. Talk to us, both of you, if you would, about what's different this year. How do you, as journalists, how do you approach covering the story in a pandemic? That's one whole thing. So I'm talking to both of you. We're all in our homes right now in DC. So if you could talk about that, and then also talk about Trump, covering Trump, who knows something about how to get his own message out. irrespective of what the media covers. So maybe you could talk about both of those things. Jackson, first the pandemic. How do you cover a story at a time like this?
Yeah, unfortunately, we've had to be way less ambitious in terms of travel for this. And I think back to the 2016 election, I think I visited 18 states or 16 states. And this time around, we did a few of the primaries, and then the pandemic hit. And really, since then, we've been very selective about what we go to. And of course, I think, two big stories that are naturals out of this. One is the unprecedented interest in early voting. And in the states that we have managed to visit by driving this time instead of flying, it's universal. The lineups for early voting are incredible. And I think that's what really tells the story of this election. Because, Donald Trump is a known quantity at this point. So there's less of that sort of enigma around him. People know what they're going to get with him. There's less sort of infatuation with every little thing he says. Really, it's the story of people mobilizing to vote. And then sort of second, in terms of how this has changed the way we cover the election, is that when we go to some of these events, specifically I'm thinking these Trump rallies where there are no masks and there is no social distancing, certainly we've had to make a calculation about what kind of risks we as journalists are willing to take. And that has tended to keep us in a place where we're only talking to supporters outside of the venue in a space that we can control, where we can keep our distance from people who are oftentimes not wearing masks. We've sort of made the decision that we're not going inside these packed venues. It's not worth the risk. And there's always a pool camera in there that is, bringing the general shots of the stage and the crowd. So really not worth the risk just to go in.
Katie, how has it changed, how has it changed for you in terms of trying to get the story, whether it's pandemic or whether it's Donald Trump?
Well, a big part of what we do as foreign correspondents in a different country is we try to go out and talk to real people who are out voting, and what it is about this election that has either changed their mind and shaped their decision. Because, the daily sort of ups and downs of daily news coming out of the White House and that sort of thing, we're going to get that from the American network's coverage. Our value added here is to go out and talk to real people and sort of understand the temperature of the country and best explain that to our viewers in Canada about why they might be seeing certain things happening. Because of the pandemic, that has become a lot more difficult. As Jackson said, we can't travel as much. We have been doing some travel. Like I'm going to Miami for the election. I'm leaving on Saturday. We have plans to go to an election. We have a number of election watch parties that we've lined up on Tuesday night where we plan to go. Some of them at this stage, I understand, are indoors, but that's a risk that we sort of have to talk about and take. Are we going to be wearing our N95s? Are we going to make sure that we sort of keep our distance? As I mentioned, when we went to that debate watch party back in Ohio, we were wearing our masks. We had our 6-foot-long microphone pole, and we tried as best we could to make sure that we were being as safe as we could. And also because we sort of have been traveling, we don't want to put anyone else in danger. It's not just about us, it's about other people. And a lot of these people aren't wearing masks. So again, it's really made it more difficult to really get out there on the ground and talk to people. But we have been doing more stories sort of in the district area. So yesterday we had a story on the National where we talked to a number of diverse candidates, a transgender woman who's running for state senate in Delaware. That's close enough where we can work with a freelancer to make that happen. Interviewing candidates here in DC. So it just shifts things a little bit, just enough that it sort of changed how we operate, but we're still trying to tell the same stories to explain to Canadians why you look at the news, you wonder why something is happening, and it's our job to go talk to real people who are voting to explain to Canada why certain things may be the way they are.
And Katie, when you're thinking about that, about what to cover, the fact that you're going to Miami, who you're going to talk to, take us behind the curtain a little bit about how, do you get to decide that? Is it a negotiation between you and somebody in Canada? Who decides on a daily basis what the menu will be for the nightly news from CBC? Well, and then Jackson, tell me if it's any different for you.
So for the election itself, those plans are done by way above my pay grade. I was told that would be my assignment, but we very much get to pitch our own stories. And if we have an idea and there's something that stands out to us, we can pitch it. And as long as it's something that's reasonable, it's not going to cost a fortune to get somewhere. It's not going to put anyone's lives in danger, that kind of thing. generally we are encouraged to tell as many stories as we can and really emphasize and really focus on those original stories when we have the opportunity. Any story we pitch, again, as long as it's reasonable, generally we can go out and do.
Jackson, do you drive what you do on a daily basis, or is it an overlord somewhere in the great north that tells you what they want to see regularly?
No, as bureau chief down here, I have a pretty extensive role in deciding what we're going to cover day to day, and specifically around the election, we've also brought 5 other crews into the country that are around various states. So a big part of it is working with our whole team and our editorial team back in Canada to say, here's what the big themes are of the day, and how do we make sure that we're not overlapping, but also that we're adding deeper value for our audience. So what that often looks like is that I may do sort of an overview piece on either the state of the campaign or the sort of the key issue of the day, and then we're going to go to one of our reporters who's in one of the other states right now for maybe a deeper dive on one of those issues. That tends to be how we sort of carve up the pie. Much like Katie says, though, we love to do original things. We love to pitch angles that aren't necessarily part of the day-to-day back and forth. And I think really that's what our team is interested in. And we try and look at things from a perspective of how does this impact Canadians, or how does this inform Canadians to the greatest possible degree? That's not just the daily back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. What's going to give our audience the big picture understanding of what's going on?
Okay, so I'm getting a lot of questions here. I'm trying to weave them together into some themes, so I'll try to do that. Who is the nicest politician that you've interviewed? And contrastly, what's the most bizarre experience since you've both been in Washington? Katie, where were you pleasantly surprised?
Here's the thing. I genuinely want to say I don't necessarily think in terms of who's nice, who's not nice. It's when you get an interview, it's does it make news or does it not make news? And that's sort of how I sort of think about things. I've never really gone down that nice route.
If you say nothing, you don't want it, right? Like if somebody's really nice and they don't make news, it's like, well, that was a waste of my time.
Well, no, I'm always pleased when someone does give me some of their time, because I know people have very, very difficult schedules, but I don't think I've ever judged an interviewee on whether they're nice or mean. It's, did this interview make news, and can I tell Canadians something new that they didn't know before?
Okay, so what's the best get you've gotten since you've been here, Katie?
So we went out before the pandemic, in the before times, as we like to say. We went out and did a lot of traveling for the primaries, and we got real close to Joe Biden. I got an interview with Jill Biden, and this was before Joe Biden had won the Democratic nomination. And so we went and talked to her. It's a very funny story. We just randomly happened to run into her, and that's what happens when you go and cover the primaries. We were in New Hampshire, we were driving around, and we were trying to go interview people at field offices, and the Bernie field office people, they wouldn't let us in. The Elizabeth Warren people wouldn't let us in, but then we go knocking on Joe Biden's field office in New Hampshire, and they're like, yeah, come on in. And they're like, are you here for Jill Biden? I'm like, can we be here for Jill Biden? Mm-hmm. She comes on in, we ask for an interview, she says, sure. And there was an issue that day. Did she know you were Canadian? Oh, I identified myself. I'm like, hi, we're a Canadian news crew. And so we asked her about some Canadian related issues that serve our audience. And, from her perspective, she's a big part of his campaign. From her perspective, where does she see things going from there in terms of international relations? But also on that day, there just happened to be a moment when the Biden campaign had actually gone negative in some of its campaign ads against their competitors. And so it was a really shift in tone. And so we were able to get something that was relevant on that front, as well as something that was relevant on the Canada-US front. But we caught up with Joe Biden once. We happened to be staying at the same hotel as him. We caught up with Bernie Sanders once because we happened to be staying at the same hotel with him. We chased his bus around a hotel for an hour one morning because we were trying to get to him. His handlers blocked us, but that's kind of like the primary season when you go out and do those kinds of things. And that's how you get those unexpected moments that can yield news for your audience.
Jackson, what's the most bizarre experience you've had since you've been here covering U.S.?
Yeah, it's a long list. I've been here 6 years, and it's a very long list. But I think on the sort of political front, when the issue of child separation at the border actually first popped up down here, under the Trump administration, when you heard about the awful way to phrase it, but kids in cages. We actually tracked down the former head of ICE, which runs the detention program, and he was the head of ICE under Obama. And we know that that program started in the tail end of the Obama years, but wasn't really used. And we did an interview with him where he explained that here's why this policy is awful, because when you separate these children from their parents, the parents end up being deported to their home country. The children are put into an entirely different stream than the parents because you can't detain them together. And you're going to end up with children who are orphaned. They'll be in the care of the US government, perhaps permanently. They may never be reunited with their parents. And so we flushed out the nuance of that at the time and did that as a story and really sort of warned that this was what was going to be coming down the pipe as a result of this policy. And, just in the past week, it's been confirmed there's almost 600 children that have never been reunited with their parents. But at the time we did the story, and I also sort of tweeted out a thread about the warnings coming from this former official who used to run this exact program. And it got picked up so far and wide that within 2 days, my tweets were being read out verbatim in the UK House of Commons during question time, pressing the government as to whether they were going to pressure the US government to abandon this policy. And that was just totally unintentional, but I think it shows you kind of the power that journalists like Katie and I have, in the sense that we don't have to worry about the day-to-day back and forth. Nancy Pelosi said this, Mitch McConnell said that. We're stepping back, we're giving our audience the view from 10,000 feet and sort of explaining what these policy decisions mean in a real world practical sense. And sometimes that has really interesting consequences.
Very interesting. And since you mentioned the child separation policy, and that has to do with the way Trump deals with immigration broadly, let me ask both of you about the recent proposed regulation where Trump has said to foreign journalists, you can only stay here 8 months. And then you're going to have to, tell us about it, Jackson. You actually brought us up to speed on it the other day. You've been here 6 years. Are you going to get kicked out if Trump is reelected? And Katie, are you going to have to give up that glorious flat you have in DC? Jackson, what's the state of play there?
Yeah, so here's what's going on is the Trump administration is proposing, it's called a rule change. So it means there's no congressional approval required. And they've got 3 classes of visas that they're trying to change the rules on. And one of them is the I visa, which is used by foreign journalists like Katie and I. And it allows us to live and establish residency in the country for a 5-year period on the understanding that we're working for a foreign media company. We're not being paid by an American company. We're not taking away any American jobs. But what they did is they lumped journalists in with a broader crackdown on student visas, where they allege that there's widespread abuse. And they just sort of quietly tucked the journalists in there. And what they're saying is that foreign reporters should, instead of having a 5-year visa, be given a 240-day or 8-month visa with one maximum extension of a further 8 months allowed. Really, that's problematic for a whole bunch of reasons. One, if you're being assigned to cover the US, how do you sign a lease on an apartment for 8 months with that kind of uncertainty that you may not be renewed? Number two, I think our audiences get better quality journalism by having people who can spend a long period of time here and really dive into the nuance. This is a complicated country. There's a lot to learn here. And I can tell you, my first 2 years here were a really, really steep learning curve, just trying to get up to speed on that. So there is a lot of concern about whether or not this would come through. The Trump administration has said they want to push this change through the end of, before the end of 2020. But from a practical sense, it's not clear when it might actually kick into effect. I can tell you that broadcasters from around the world, including both Katie and mine, have filed submissions with the Department of Homeland Security because they are seeking input on these policies as to whether or not they're realistic. The European Broadcast Union has submitted a statement as well. And so really there's a hope, at least, that they reevaluate this. And I think, just as a final note here, that the one thing the policy does not distinguish is between people who may be coming from non-visa waiver countries. That's a country where you can't just come to the US like a Canadian could. You need a visa to come here. People may come from those countries just to shoot or do one story. They may only need to be here for a month. This policy does not distinguish between somebody who's coming from one of those countries for a short period of time and somebody like Katie or myself who is stationed here for a long period of time.
Well, it seems to me that on that, the argument, the US government, particularly the current one, doesn't really care what Global News Canada or CBC has to say. But it's kind of like trade policy. If other countries start expelling US journalists or start limiting US journalists access to cover foreign markets, then you might have a situation where there's some symmetry. But while we're on the topic of foreigners and all of that. Katie, let me ask you about the notion, we've been asked by one of our attendees, the notion about false information that is finding its way into this election cycle. We know that in 2016, Russia really was successful in some ways at planting disinformation. I think we all saw the Hunter Biden story and the back and forth about that. What is that? How do you think about that? How real is that? How should people sort through and understand what's real, what's fake? What's your perspective on that?
Well, it is such a puzzling situation right now. It is such a difficult situation to sort of navigate through because there is so much false information out there, whether it's coming from foreign adversaries who are trying to interfere in the election. We heard from the FBI saying that Iran and Russia are both trying to put out disinformation. But also you have to take a look at some of the claims coming from the president himself. And that is a concern that I think is something that I don't think we've figured out how to deal with just yet. And there's a quote from Steve Bannon. I'm not going to say the actual quote because the quote has a swear word and this is a family-friendly audience. But he referred to when you just put out so much false information that your opponent doesn't know what to do. And he called it flooding the zone with crap, shall we say. And it becomes this situation where there is so much false information out there. Where do you even start to begin? And so it's really important that when you are buckling down to write your story and what are you going to present to your audience, you need to make sure that what you're presenting is factually accurate to begin with. That's the basic of any story you're going to tell. You need to make sure your facts are accurate. But when you're sorting through this, how much of the story do you acknowledge that this is an issue? Daniel Dale, who is a fact checker for the Toronto Star, who's now gone on to be a fact checker for CNN, he was interviewed once where he's saying when he was covering the 2016 election, he didn't understand how the lies were not the story. Other things would be the story. The lies that were coming out of one campaign, how was that not the story? And so we've seen Daniel Dale's success as a fact checker going from the Toronto Star to CNN, being featured in their primetime election broadcasts. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the answer is. And it's a really tricky situation.
You know, I was invited for many years to go to a corporate retreat for a company, and as one of their, the view from the Beltway. And I think I went, and it was a corporate retreat for all their customers. And so it was a pretty awesome junket. We'd go to some fabulous resort somewhere, and they would have sort of 3 days of socializing and then kind of like an hour and a half of substance. So I was responsible for maybe 45 minutes of the substance. And right after Trump was elected, my presentation was, and this was like the 8th year I had been invited, my presentation was on, there was a story in Politico actually, that was Trump's Lies in Your Brain. And it was about sort of the science behind how human beings process misinformation. And I tried to be very academic about it and analytical and not not myself say that Trump is lying, but say like, this is how people are thinking about this. And, I didn't get invited back ever again. Like the whole idea that I would say out loud that President Trump is lying was something that they didn't appreciate. And so, do you feel when you get into trying to fact check, do you feel retaliation? Do you get frozen out sometimes from the White House or your sources, or, how do you deal with this constant tension between, as Katie says, the president saying something that's like demonstrably false and not only saying it once, but flooding the zone with it, like tons of it. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think a couple things have happened here. One is that we're, and this has sort of been an evolution, I think, for every news organization. One is that you don't just throw things on the air anymore without making sure that there is a tremendous amount of context around it. Number two is when it's very clear that something is a lie, you call it a lie. And I think in the early days, there were a lot of editorial discussions focused on this question of, well, can you say it's a lie? You don't know what the intent is behind the statement. So can you really come out there and say it's a lie? But I think 4 years in, we're at the point now where when the same lie is peddled over and over and over again, it's very clear that this is being presented falsely, but on purpose. And I don't think there's any hesitance to call that out. I think that the number one thing we sort of hear from viewers in particular, though, is that they're uncomfortable sometimes with contextualization or fact checking. And maybe it's a failing of the media itself. Maybe we haven't been good at that for a long time. And now that we're getting better at that, it strikes people as a bit jarring. But I do know I hear a lot of complaints from viewers that when you call something out as being factually incorrect or misinformation or a full-fledged lie, that they're quick to call you out and say that you're being biased for doing so.
How do you? So let me pull back for a second and talk about how people receive their information, because you're not that old, but maybe at the beginning of your career, journalism looked different because there was less of an opportunity. Well, you didn't have a president of the United States tweeting directly until this one, and Joe Biden has a podcast. And there's any citizen can convey information to anyone in the world. So how has social media and the way people consume information and live their lives, how has it changed the role of journalism, and what kind of adjustments do you make in how you pursue your craft? Katie?
That's a really tough one, because I think a lot of media organizations are really struggling with this. And this is like a bigger picture issue when it comes to local news, when it comes to the role that social media plays in publishing news, and what we do as traditional media organizations. For me personally, I don't think we can ignore this is something we've talked about before, but I don't think it's something that we can ignore when, you take a look at the president or you take a look at Joe Biden, and they have their own sort of way to get their message out to their base, whether it is on Twitter, whether it is on Facebook, whether it's Joe Biden's podcast. And I think we have to pay attention to what's going on in that space, because at the same time we think, oh, well, it's just a tweet. Oh, well, it's just that. These are the power players who are either the decision makers or poised to possibly become the decision makers in this country. And so we have to pay attention to all of these different elements, and trying to keep up with everything has really made the news cycle become such a quick churn that it becomes a challenge to keep up with everything that's going on. It's like a fire hose of information. And the struggle is trying to make sure that you are able to sort of keep up and make sure you're getting the information that will help your viewer better understand the story of what's going on down here. You can't get too into the weeds, and that's another risk that we're seeing right now. Like if you take a look at what President Trump, in his personal attacks on Joe Biden and Joe Biden's son, Donald Trump is pushing that narrative about the laptop, the Hunter Biden laptop, and the emails and all of those things. Because there's so much coverage on Fox News, if you watch Fox News, you might understand what the president is saying at his rallies. But the rest of the mainstream media isn't really covering it in that same way. They're not airing the allegations, because a lot of the allegations can't be verified. So Donald Trump will stand up at a rally at a podium and say all of these things that the mainstream audience, if they sat down and watched it, they might not understand what's going on. So it's a very strange situation that I don't necessarily see anyone coming up with some sort of strategy to understand this at this point in time.
Jackson, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm with Katie on this. I mean, I think part of our job now, when it comes to using social media as part of our reporting, is to use it as a way to break the information bubble, so that you can explain to people, hey, here's what Trump is telling his supporters that you might not see in day-to-day coverage, but this will help you understand where they're coming from and what their thinking is. I was just at a Trump rally in North Carolina, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, and talking to supporters. And really, I think what is remarkable is how influential these information bubbles are, especially the stuff that spreads on Twitter and on Facebook. And talk to 10 different people, they are all quoting the exact same story with the same statistics down to the number. That's how really tightly packed this is. And it is, as I say, it's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's Fox News. And I think it's important for our audience to understand sort of where people are coming from and how they get their information plays into that.
Let's bring it back to Canada-U.S. relations for a second. We spent a lot of time talking about the challenges of covering Trump and false information and this and that. What do you think the biggest implications are for the Canada-U.S. relationship and for Canada if Biden is elected? And then let's also talk about Next, we'll talk about the other elections that are happening. The United States Senate, for example, could change. So, Katie, what's the biggest Canada-U.S. story coming out of this election if Joe Biden wins?
Well, I know one thing that my sources are concerned about is what happens on the energy file and climate change. So I've already reported this, so this is not, I'm not breaking news here in this.
Oh, you
this
can break
venue.
News here. That's good.
But I think my bosses might not like that. No, but according to conversations that I've had with sources about what's going on behind the scenes, the Prime Minister had a call this week with his consuls general and the ambassador about what to expect, what's going on with the election. And a couple of the issues that came up, one, COVID is making sure that the fight around COVID and border restrictions, that's a big issue, but we can get to that in a second. But one thing that might change under a Biden presidency would be, well, trade is one thing, because Joe Biden has been talking about how he wants a Buy America policy that could hurt Canadian companies who want some procurement contracts in the United States. But energy is going to be a big thing. While the Democrats and the Liberals might be seen as very much on the same page when it comes to believing in climate change, wanting to fight climate change, wanting to be a part of the Paris Accord, Joe Biden has already confirmed that if he does become president, he will do what he can to stop the Keystone XL pipeline. Now, there will be some court challenges. I don't know if he can just instantly do that. That is sort of an opinion that is still hasn't necessarily been decided at this point. But what a source said to me this week is that the Canadian government, if Joe Biden does win, they will make it clear to the Biden administration, if that is the case, that the Keystone XL pipeline project is one that Canada believes in, that Canada wants to continue with, and that will sort of be the position there. That was a challenge between the previous Obama government and the administration and the previous conservative government of Stephen Harper. So it would be a rehashing of that dispute, except it'll be a Joe Biden administration and a liberal Canadian government that is pushing to get this pipeline project to go ahead. So that's just one of the issues I think is going to be a concern. The other is what to do about COVID. My sources have been telling me they don't want to see a change in the border restrictions until there is significant evidence that the spread of COVID is under control in some way, shape, or form in the United States. As the United States continues to hit record high in their caseloads, I'm not quite sure when the Canadian government will see what they want to see to dial down those restrictions. But again, we do have that pilot project in Alberta, so that might be one about lessening the quarantine time when you come in from another country.
Yeah, the rapid testing.
But right now, those are the big issues that I'm aware that the Canadian government is thinking about and having conversations about.
Jackson, what do you think the biggest implication is for Canada in a Biden election? We know, Katie mentions the Buy American, but that is something, Trump has been America first, and we've had, protectionist tendencies in every procurement bill in our lifetime. So what do you see as the most immediate big implication for Canada in the event Biden wins?
Yeah, I think, Katie nailed all of it. I think the biggest, most visible one might be a little more stability, a little more return to norms when it comes to the two governments working in concert, when it comes to things like NATO. I think that might be the most sort of visible change in the forefront. And you might even get, if COVID gets under control, formal state visits again between the two countries as one example, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Katie, I don't think President Trump was ever actually invited for a formal visit to Canada outside of a G8 summit.
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. I know Mike Pence went when they were in the middle of some NAFTA talks, but other than Charlevoix, I don't think President Donald Trump went, and I'm just trying to think of if there was an invitation. Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but I believe you were right.
So. Yeah, I don't think he was invited.
In fact, I think I asked the Prime Minister about that at the UN one year, and he danced around even extending a formal invite. So that visible normalization, I think, would be an obvious change.
And let's also, you mentioned the UN, which is a perfect segue. Do you see Canada's role in the world being amplified if you have an American president who again wants to embrace global institutions? Canada has often in the history of Canada, US, and in history generally, Canada has often played that bridge, that bridge between the rest of the world and the US as our neighbor and the kind of the US whisper. Is there an appetite back home for that kind of role, whether it's the WTO, the UN, the WHO, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, all of these different institutions? Do you see Canada kind of leaning into that, or is that just the fodder for academics and pundits? Katie, what do you think?
Well, we certainly saw when Chrystia Freeland was foreign minister and Donald Trump was really trying to pull the United States back on that world stage, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, pulling out of the Paris Accord, that Canada really tried to step up to fill that leadership void, to say, hey, these institutions that have been in place since the end of the Second World War, these are important. And these, for the last 70 years, it's important that we continue to respect these institutions, because this is what has allowed us to live generally, in a semblance of peace for the last 70 years. And so I think that if you do see President Donald Trump reelected, that perhaps you see Canada continuing to try to embrace that role. But as the world fights COVID, and there's so much concern about challenges at home and healthcare and just keeping populations safe, keeping people employed, I question how much appetite there is going to be from the public itself to really put a lot of energy into fostering those international relationships, those international alliances at a time when if Canada goes through a very, very difficult winter when it comes to COVID. Now, I suspect the Liberal government would probably argue now is a stronger time. It's more important now than ever, when the world is dealing with this significant challenge, to make sure we reinforce support for those kinds of institutions. But that is going to be, if Donald Trump wins re-election, which very well could happen. I have no predictions about what's going to happen.
So you're predicting Donald Trump's winning. Got it.
That sounds. I'm looking forward to someone tweeting that, and then I'm looking forward to the reaction. But I think that will be a very valid question about what is that going to do for international alliances when domestic populations are going through such difficult circumstances.
Jackson, Trump has basically run against China. And Biden is no friend of China either. Canada has its own very serious challenges with China. What is the role that China plays in world affairs, and how do you think about covering these relations, or do you think about it? Is it even possible?
Yeah, I think if it weren't for COVID, there would be a lot more focus on the international pecking order right now. And I think instead what you're going to see is more and more countries turning inward. I think you may see China continue as it has done to try and step up and use this as an opportunity to make investments and build inroads in countries that are not necessarily in its sphere of influence right now. We've seen a lot of that in Africa, for example, so sort of making a long-term play for the future. One sort of interesting thing, I think, that if hypothetical Trump wins the election, but the COVID situation also comes under control. We were talking about the media visa issue and how that's lumped in with student visas earlier. If it's a lot harder for foreign students to come to the US, you bet they're looking at Canada as a next best thing. And I think the opportunities for countries like Canada are a little more subtle. Perhaps they're in the background, but if COVID stops this sort of international turn inward and the US remains as it is right now, I think that might be where you see the sort of greatest change in development.
It might even be a better thing. I mean, I've said, I'm American and I love my country, but, I've said about Canada when I'm describing it, it's a lot of the best things about the U.S. without a lot of the bad things, So I think there is a competitive advantage for Canada to the extent the U.S. turns inward and Canada remains open to immigration. I think you're right, Jackson. That's a huge advantage. Okay, I said earlier that we would talk about the other elections, not just the presidential. So I want to switch for a minute and ask you both: Are you covering the Senate and the House? The House being Democratic, the Senate being Republican. I have my own views, but nobody cares about my views. We care about your views. So, Katie, how are you looking at the other elections that are happening?
Well, tonight on CBC News, The National, as well as CBC News World at 6 on radio. If you tune in, you're going to, I don't want to give anything away.
I didn't know this. This was not pre-cooked by the way.
No, this is not pre-planned.
This sounds like a softball, but anyway,
No,
keep going.
No, so we're gonna be doing a story today. As long as there's no breaking news, and I sort of get bumped. But we've been over the past couple of days, we've been working on a story about the Senate race and why the Senate is so important. Because I don't necessarily know if your average Canadian understands why the race for who controls the Senate is so important. And so today we're going to sort of be explaining that. As Jackson says, we're going to be taking that view from the helicopter to try to explain. Okay, well, if Donald Trump wins the White House, but the Democrats gain control of the Senate, why Donald Trump won't be able to get his agenda through, or vice versa. If Joe Biden wins the White House, but Republicans maintain control of the Senate, why it's going to be difficult to get anything kind of done. So while the race for the White House is extremely important, we also need to be mindful of what's going on in the U.S. Senate, because it is such a powerful, important body.
Jackson, how are you thinking about the down ballot races, as we call them?
Yeah, the biggest thing I've sort of been cautioning our teams about as we do our election planning is that, much like the midterms, the sort of full scope of how the House and Senate races play out may not be known for days, or in some cases weeks, right? California is really slow to count. And I remember thinking back to the midterms 2 years ago, we sort of thought, oh, maybe the Democrats' blue wave didn't really materialize, that they've got a slight edge in the House, it's not that big. And then within 2 weeks, as the full count came through, we realized this was substantial. And we could be looking at a repeat of that. I don't think it's going to be super close in the House. I think Democrats are going to maintain their position there. But the Senate, if it comes down to a single seat, specifically Georgia, we might not know who has control of the Senate, right, until after that runoff election in December, because they have a whole different sort of set of rules in that state.
I'm glad you said that. I was just going to say that I came up politically in Georgia, and by the way, the last time a Democrat won the White House in Georgia was 1992, Bill Clinton, but there was a Senate runoff that year. So in Georgia, you have a majority vote rule, and you have kind of a jungle system. So there are actually 2 Senate seats that are on the ballot, which is quite unusual in Georgia, and it's because Johnny Isakson, the incumbent, stepped down because he's sick, unfortunately. So you have two Senate seats up, and you have multiple candidates running for each seat. And if no candidate gets a majority of votes, 50% plus 1, then they go into a runoff. I think it's actually January 5th, Jackson. So I think if Georgia is in a runoff, which I think it will be for, if not one, both seats, I think both of you might be hanging out in Atlanta, Georgia, because if the Senate is evenly divided up until we count the ballots, then you don't know if Mitch McConnell is going to be the leader or Chuck Schumer. And as Katie said, the Senate is, she didn't say it quite this way, but I'll say it. The Senate is equally powerful to the White House. It is nothing like the Canadian parliamentary system. We have divided branches of government with equal authority. And so any United States senator has as much power and influence as the United States president. And that's meaningful, and that could impact Canada. So are you thinking about going to Atlanta, or have you thought about that after this, Katie?
I haven't thought just yet, but we did go to Atlanta earlier this year. We went to Atlanta. Georgia was one of the first states to start lifting its COVID restrictions. So it's only an 8-hour drive from Washington.
That's right. And apparently you feel safer driving than flying. Or
you know what?
Or it's cheaper. I don't know.
No. Well, first of all, from like a camera crew perspective, it is just so much easier to take one car, put all of your gear in the trunk of a minivan, and drive wherever you're going, between getting everything through security, getting everything on a plane, hoping everything gets shipped on the right plane. It's kind of just easier that way, whether it's COVID or not. But then there is the complicated risk of COVID, and it's something that every decision needs to be on sort of a case-by-case basis. And like we're flying to Miami, so that will certainly be. It's my first work trip in the pandemic on a plane, so it's going to be interesting. I don't know how I'm going to feel about that, but I'm comfortable going to Miami. I'm excited for the coverage we're going to do, but it's something that I will be thinking about. We're going to wear N95s. I bought a face shield. I've got goggles too, so like I'm going to try and be as safe as I can be.
Casting forward, when we know, we've had a couple more questions. Let's talk about the aftermath. So we talked about maybe the runoff in Georgia, the counting of ballots. We talked a little bit about the potential for chaos. Two different questions from our audience have emerged, 2 different sides of the same coin. One is, if Biden's elected, do you see an end to the divisiveness in the U.S.? We're pretty divided as a country now. People feel pretty strongly. So that's the first question. And then the other side of that coin is, a pretty dramatic one, but I think it's real. Do you see the possibility of the U.S. going back into the civil unrest brewing such that it turns into a civil war? You know, we've had that in our country. So maybe talk about those two potential scenarios. Jackson?
Yeah, I will say I take the more optimistic view, which is that, yeah, there have been some very disturbing plots here. You know, we're thinking about that plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan as one example. They've also been caught and foiled. And I think at the end of the day, the number of these militia members who are willing to undertake, you know, a violent uprising is not big enough to counter the force of law enforcement. I think that's the general hope here. You know, I was reading a profile, I believe it was in The Atlantic, about one of these militia groups, and the guy who's preparing for, you know, the big civil uprising and is trying to recruit ex-law enforcement members is also a guy who once shot himself in the eye while cleaning his gun. And I know that's just sort of a sense here that, like, these are individuals who may have intent. Their ability to execute, I think there was a question about that, and I think that it's well on the radar of law enforcement down here. So I think we hope that it doesn't come to those worst case scenarios. And talking to everyday Trump supporters, you know, the folks at the rallies, they'll say, you know, will I be upset if Joe Biden wins? Yes. Will I move on? Yes. That is an election. Elections are won and lost. There has to be a winner and there has to be a loser. As for the sort of bigger question of, you know, how does this all get decided? Does it get decided neatly and simply? I was speaking to a state attorney in Florida yesterday, and of course, we all know how close that state can and will be. And he said, you know, he's optimistic we're going to have a decisive win one way or the other on election night. So I think there's always the potential for things to be bad. I do think that looking at the polls without predicting a winner here, there's also the potential for a very clean, decisive win that sort of removes any lingering doubt about the election result.
And do you see partisanship if Biden wins? Do you see it ebbing? Or do
no. You know, I've had this discussion with a few people of, would the pandemic have played out any differently if Hillary Clinton had been president? And I think there's a sense that, okay, maybe there would have been a firmer national strategy, but you would still have, you know, conservative media bubbles going anti-mask, anti-lockdown. All those things would still be there, and those were all impediments to the idea that the country is all going to row in the same direction to address a common issue. So I don't see partisanship disappearing. And in fact, I think you can make the argument that bubbles on either side do better when they're in opposition than when they're in power in terms of recruiting people and gathering interest.
Katie, how do you see this? How do you see, do you see the potential for it spinning out of control?
Yes, and I think one way that perhaps the situation won't spin out of control is if there is a decisive victory one way or the other. And as Jackson said, you know, people might be disappointed, but this is democracy. And whether it's a Trump win, whether it's a Biden win, can either side sort of accept the results? Now, we already know that Donald Trump has tried to sow doubt about the results of the election, sort of not just suggesting, saying that the only way he could lose is if there's some sort of fraud or it's rigged. And so that is going to be a challenge, because if Donald Trump's base believes that and feeds into that could lead to some trouble. Joe Biden, during that ABC town hall the night the second debate was canceled, Joe Biden talked about how one of the first things he wants to do if he's elected is to reach out to Republicans and try to restore some sort of bipartisanship, working together for the good of Americans. He might want to try to do that. I don't know if we're ever going to be able to dial back partisanship. I don't know if that's something that's going to happen. We see sort of the people who championed that in the past, like people like John McCain, people who really, people like Mitt Romney. John McCain has passed away. Mitt Romney is not necessarily near the end of his career, but, you know, he's not new to politics. And the question is, are we seeing less partisanship in the new generation of lawmakers that are coming in? And I don't think we are. I think partisanship is here to stay. Partisanship helps with fundraising. Partisanship helps motivate your base. So why change if it's helping you motivate?
So let me, we're reaching I think we have 5 or 6 more minutes. Let me move to something that's related, but we haven't talked about yet. And I think it's maybe the other very big story this year and very important thing, which is Black Lives Matter. It's related to social unrest. Talk to us about, this all happened, right in front of you. Black Lives Matter Plaza is right down the street from all three of us. So maybe walk us through kind of that story, that issue, and as Canadians, how you think about it, how you've experienced it here in the U.S., and whether or not this is a phenomenon that will live on in our public discourse, or whether it was just if it was just a moment of 2020. Jackson?
I think the biggest thing that sort of changed over the course of this is how broad and widespread the movement became, and the fact that you saw white suburban mums coming in and marching with this, and then you look at the polling that has spun out of this, would suggest that like a broad segment of Americans now realize that systemic racism exists, that white privilege exists. Those things have become mainstream ideas now, and really, there was an effort by the White House to sort of paint everybody protesting as violent anarchists, but we know that's not the case. I mean, we know that the vast majority of people at these marches were peaceful, and then you get the people who do filter in and try and cause disruption and unrest. I also think, lastly, that there is a broad recognition and understanding of just how deep-seated systemic racism in this country and the generational pain that is there and has never been addressed and needs to be addressed. And I think, it does mark a watershed moment from which there's no turning back now.
And does it exist in Canada too?
Yes, absolutely.
We'll talk about that for a second. Katie, how have you looked at the Black Lives Matter movement, and how is it, how has it affected the way you think about what's happening in the U.S. and in Canada?
Well, it's, as Jackson mentioned, the broad support across most parts of America for this movement, I think, is a suggestion that this is a movement that's here to stay. It's not just a moment. That the death of George Floyd at the hands of police. If anyone listened to the Daily the other day of suburban women talking about what has shaped their vote, and how the moment when George Floyd in that video called out to his mama, and how that moment and that his cry for help in that moment helped change the way people think about racism, about institutional racism and systemic problems in America, in inequality and injustice. Moments like that stay with people for the rest of their lives. And I think that moment and the reckoning around it will change and shape the way that American politicians need to lead going forward, and the conversation around these issues, because America is listening.
That's really important to think about. And I asked it briefly, and maybe we'll wrap on this. What are the lessons for Canada in all of these things, in the way the U.S. political discourse is going, in Black Lives Matter, in what's happening? What do you think is most important for Canada, thinking about itself in the world, should take from all this? Jackson, first you, and then Katie, we'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I will even add the coronavirus into that list of subjects, Scotty. And I think that the takeaway for Canada is, don't assume these things aren't happening in your own country. Don't get smug about where you are based on what you're seeing in the United States, because these are real issues that are faced in Canada as well. It's very easy to look at the scope and scale of what's happening in the US and think, well, thank goodness that's not us, when in fact these issues are happening in Canada and need to be addressed with the same seriousness and rigor, I think. And I think it's very easy, in fact, for everyday Canadians to perhaps dilute themselves into thinking that's not happening here when it is.
Thanks, Jackson. Katie, your thoughts, implications?
I could not agree with Jackson more. It's such a popular thing for Canadians to sort of look down their nose and look at the problems in America and think, well, I'm so glad this, that, and the other. Canada faces very similar challenges, and those problems exist in Canada as well. And the reckoning that's happening in the United States has woken up parts of Canada to have a better realization that these problems exist in our country as well. So on that note, I absolutely agree with everything Jackson just said. One other thing I think there is to sort of be learned from all this has to do with partisanship. And as I mentioned, I don't think we're going to be dialing back the partisanship anytime soon, but watching how I think it's amplified down here. Watching how sort of bitter disputes, political disputes, are going, and how personal things get. It's if what happens in the United States filters down and starts happening in the Canadian political discourse, it's watching how the personal attacks when people are trying to do politics. Watching it up close it's jarring. And whether Canada is watching this and is fine with it or is uncomfortable with it, it's something that I think Canadians sort of be conscious of.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I want to say thank you on my own behalf, and I think David is going to jump back into this and wrap us all up. So I just really appreciate the dialogue. It's always good to talk to both of you, and I hope our participants have enjoyed it as much as I have. And then over to you, David.
Thank you, Scotty. I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope you had a good time. As we talk about politics and the importance of the election that's ahead of us in the United States that the world is watching, I'm just reminded about the power and importance of journalism, of facts, and of a healthy, robust infrastructure that allows our democracies to work around the world. And so I want to thank Katie and Jackson for your investment in ensuring that estate is maintained and is managed responsibly. And I look forward to watching you both as I flip through channels, because I don't pick news outlets. I get my information from a variety of sources. So thank you for being here and being with us. And Scotty, thank you for being a wonderful moderator and expert. I can tell you my phone was lighting up, my Apple computer and iPad were like, we love Scotty, Scotty's the best. And I can tell you she is the best. And if you,
I appreciate my family, my immediate family texting you like that. They're always on call. It's very nice.
I think, I can say Scotty's been very helpful to me in my professional life. I have had files that have crossed most of the borders and trying to understand how that works. She's a very trusted advisor to people who have roles like mine. If you want to see more of Scotty and learn more about the Canada America Business Council, I encourage you to attend an event on November 18th that I love to go to every year. It's sort of the influencer prom, if you will, in Ottawa. And it usually has diplomats, senators, members of parliament, US officials, advisors. This year it'll be virtual, so it'll be online at 5:30. I'm going to be there. I encourage you all to go. And for the first time ever, I think it's free, Scotty. I think you can sign up.
That's right.
Yeah, so you don't have to get through a barrier there. Go to the website, join us there. I'm going to be there. Scotty will be there. And it will be a wonderful, wonderful evening. If you want more of the Canadian Club, which I do, you want to join us tomorrow, October 30th. Our president, Anita, will be hosting the leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, Aaron O'Toole, to discuss his vision for Canada and what's happening in Ottawa. I want to thank again our good friends at Crestview Strategy for sponsoring this event. Our events are not possible without you. They're not possible without your partnership. We look forward to your continued generosity. I want to thank our AV suppliers, Van Valkenburg Communications and livemeeting.ca, for making it possible for us to come together virtually today. Thank you again. Stay healthy, wash your hands, wear your mask, and tune in to the election on November 3rd, which may still be going on November 18th when we're at the State of the Relationship. Bye-bye, everybody.